I never quite thought this is how I would go. Bleeding to death at the hands of those bounty hunters, on Christmas no less. Better than what I deserved, I suppose. I awoke in a sleeping bag on the beach. I found myself near a handsome gentleman with an orange mustache in a black hat. With a bit of conversation, my suspicions were proven true. Haggis here was a pirate, and no less a pirate captain. Quite a mighty handsome one at that, I might add. It would seem that he has tended to my wounds, and he's also given my right and left legs the pirate treatment as well, swapping them out for peg legs, although I suppose I should be grateful seeing how the hand mortar had blown them off. I was so grateful that he had saved my life, I decided that I would join his merry band of pirates, which it appears that it's just he and I and his shitty little dingy ship for the moment. Well, so far he's hardly what I would call a captain, and that damn thing is hardly what I would call a pirate ship. It looks like it's made of junk. I'm actually quite surprised that it even floats, but nevertheless, I'm grateful. It would seem that he's whisked me away from any of my frozen homes that I've known thus far and taken me to some islands in the east. Most importantly, these islands are fairly far away from any government authority, but just close enough to some of the local villages and what have you. Perfect for pillaging, I'm sure. But all good pirates need a proper base of operations, so we would quickly begin working on ours, deconstructing some of the long since ancient ruins in the area, as well as hacking down many a poplar and oak tree for their precious wood. Instead of completely starting from scratch, we decided that we would bend the environment to our will, using the resources like the wood that was mentioned a moment ago, as well as deconstructing a few more spots on a large section of ruins, and thus turning it into quite the rectangular home for us. On the internal parts of our little makeshift home, we have some storage areas, a nice dining area, some sleeping bags of course, as well as a wood-fired heater, that way we can go about properly cooking our meals. I must have been out for some time during the journey to these islands because it's already about mid-spring or so and the ground is completely thawed, and thus because of this we would actually go about planting some crops so we don't starve to death. But during this time, we got into a little bit of a kerfuffle. Nothing too big, just a fist fight. We beat each other's faces in for a hot moment before returning to our work of planting all of these crops, being some dyes, cotton, and even some rice for food, naturally. Later on into the evening, Haggis ended up making us some delicious meals, almost as if to say, hey, sorry about punching you in the face out in the fields earlier. I really regret that, and you know what? I found that quite sweet of him. So sweet, in fact, that the two of us kind of hit it off, if you know what I'm saying. We're lovers, that's what I'm saying. We began to think that, it might be a little bit better at night too. Even though it's already pretty warm, it might be a whole lot warmer if we had our very own little sleeping bag to snuggle up in, and thus we went about building one, of course. Ah, now that's much more cozy. But if you're like me, then you're probably curious what a pirate's life would be like if I were to, maybe accidentally get pregnant. Well, unfortunately, it seems that's no longer a possibility, or even a concern, as the same mortar that shredded my limbs has left me infertile from the attack. Speaking of attack, I'm sure there's probably bounty hunters down this way in the east, and thus I need a way to protect myself. Using some steel that we mined, as well as wood that we've harvested, I would end up making myself some throwing axes. As you could see, they were quite useful and also quite deadly. I was damn dirty accurate with them as well, which helped out quite a bit. Probably the best part about them, it was easy to refuel my pouch as it only required a few bits and bobs of steel. For many a day as the sun would rise and set and as a large wildfire had burned across these lands of this island before the rain came and put it out, we were spending our time working on our new home and also collecting plenty of resources like leathers and steel and wood and yada yada yada. Oh, this is simply a prerequisite for me to just tell you about how I ended up making making myself a large hatchet, a nice little sack to carry items around, and also a nice little cloak for myself to give myself a different look. By this point, we'd also had a good yield or two from our fields, thus giving us plenty of rice, a little bit of cotton, and also plenty of dyes, which is most important because we would actually begin utilizing those dyes to dye our clothing black, white, and a little bit of gray. The colors seem quite fitting and only natural given our new current occupation. When you see the figures walking up on your beach with black and white clothing draped upon them carrying axes, pistols, and rifles, once we get some of those, you'll know that it's the pirates. We don't really know what to call ourselves just yet. Besides, we're not exactly in this for the fame, mostly just for the loot. Speaking of which, I think this is as good a time as any to set sail around the seven seas and perhaps begin collecting some of said loot. For our very first target, we've actually detected something of a farming site on our very own island. It would seem that some of the impid tribes of this planet are attempting to expand into our little nook and cranny territory. We can't allow that. Given the quality of our ship, the sailing would take a few days, unfortunately, but we did finally arrive, and it was quite a small farming site. In terms of numbers, it would also seem that we are evenly matched. 2 farmers versus 2 pirates, but perhaps the best part is that our haggis is carrying a flintlock pistol, and these farmers only appear to have melee weapons. For whatever reason, though, the farmers themselves are not actually impids, which does mean we could burn them alive if we wanted to. We began engaging with one of the first farmers who was wielding a hatchet and running right for us. We had managed to hit her with our throwing axes a few times and also shooting her with the old pistoli. She was doing pretty good. At least for a minute or two. Not a bad fight for nothing but a farmer, I'll say. Once we were finished with her, though, we began moving on to her compadre, of course after picking up her axe and dual-wielding them like some sort of badass pirate queen. But that poor, pitiful little coward ended up getting away before we could even get a hold of him. On the bright side, it would appear that this farmer had a few cigarettes stashed away in her pocket so we could have a celebratory smoke. Now with the pitiful little farmers defeated, the pillaging and looting could truly begin. We began going building to building, looking around for any useful items, and all we really found was some corn. That being said, though, we are quite resourceful, and thus we decided to take apart some of their cloth sleeping bags for a little bit of a project. Fastening the 2 bedrolls together with some twine onto some hardy hickory sticks, we made ourselves a proper flag, sure to strike fear into the hearts of those we pillage. Who knows, with something as intimidating as this flag, they might even just give up their goods right away without a fight. But only time shall tell, and for now it's time for us to go all the way back home with many of the things that we had taken, which, since there wasn't really much in terms of goods to be looted, we just took a little of everything that we could carry on the ship. For whatever reason, those farmers had some gibbet cages that were stuffed with corpses. Well, the corpses were no good, but we did end up taking the gibbet cages and began putting them around our home, hopefully to ward off anyone who's sneaking around in the area. We would also end up throwing together a little wooden flagpole for our beautiful, intimidating flag to hopefully have the exact same effect. Speaking of people creeping and lurking around our little hideout, though, the leader of the Neanderthal tribes actually said they had a friend who wanted to learn about our culture, and if we let them stay for an extended period of time, they would give us a reward. Well, little did they know that their friend was going to be the reward, because after they arrived, we ended up arresting them. Ah, yes, they'll get a very good look at our culture from inside a little makeshift cabin jail cell, where we're actually going to begin trying to recruit them to become a pirate themselves. You don't have to feel sad for them, though. This is like asking for a scratch-off ticket and then I let you invest in my crypto scam. Wait a minute. Anyhow, though, we went to the forest once more to collect plenty of wood for yet another project. Plenty of wood that was very, floatable, if you catch my meaning. We're going to build a ship. After deconstructing our old scrap ship, we would end up building ourselves a nice wooden cog ship, which is not all that great, I'll say. It only has a spot for a helmsman, meaning that we can't have any more than one person on there. Although I don't plan on this being our primary ship, ship, we just need something a bit faster right now if the shit hits the fan. We're actually going to be building our flagship in just a little bit. But for now, this one does need a name, and we are going to be naming it the Tailed Clam. Not for any particular reason, I just sort of liked it. For our flagship, we're going to need to do some research, so we're going to need to collect the materials to build a research bench once more as we're running low currently. But while we were doing so, we had a wanderer, a cave builder, offering to join us by the name of Ripley. And since beggars, or in this case pirates, can't be choosers, we would allow her to join us, which I was quite glad about, if even just to get that beautiful blunderbuss out of her hands, if nothing else. After a bit of conversation and further inspection, I believe that she would be perfect for our merry band of pirates here. She seemed a bit rough and tough herself already. She had quite a few painful looking stab and scratch scars, meaning that she's seen some combat in her day, and also meaning that she's tough as nails, no doubt. As our little pirate crew begins to expand, it's time for us to actually begin making some proper housing for them, so we began building Ripley her own little cabin with her own cloth bedrobe, all the stuff that she would need, you know what I'm saying. But as we were constructing this cabin, we received notification that our Neanderthal prisoner was trying to get out of her cell, and that was no bueno. Ripley, eager to prove herself, was the first to meet our prisoner out into the battlefield, shooting her several times with her blunderbuss and smacking her over the head with a bottle even. After a bit more negotiating and deliberating, well, we ended up killing her by accident. Whoopsie. It looks like we made an enemy out of the Neanderthals and their chieftain for nothing, but at least we have Ripley now. And we also know that she's a really good shot, think about that. Plus, now we finally get some use out of these gibbet cages, so you know what, it's all part of the plan, baby. After that, we also began improving upon Ms. and Haggis's room together. That way they have some better flooring, they have some actual walls around it so that it is a proper bedroom, and they have all the other amenities, a dresser, end tables, you know, all that stuff. However, the renovation of their bedroom seemed to be a little bit too stressful for them, as when Haggis went to propose to Ms., she ended up declining his offer. There was no reason cited either, which is a bit of a slight towards Haggis, I'm sure, and he's going to be quite unhappy about this, unfortunately. Now that we finally have someone who is quite skilled with research in the form of Ripley, we would end up building ourselves a small research table so that she could do her work efficiently, with a nice little chair and filing cabinet to go along with it. Now you might be thinking, what in the name of the Lord would pirates need to research? Well, my friends, we're going to begin with the research of latent sails. This will essentially teach us how to make many different items that will allow us to create many different types of ships. In particular, we are interested in a caravel. This, however, will take some time, and while Ripley is working her fingers and eyes to the bone, if eyes had bones, for our new flagship, it would seem that the Neanderthals are up to no good. In the late evening hours near some small hills, we had them plotting against us. Given the strength but the lack of intelligence for Neanderthals, we thought it would be best to attack them preemptively, which at the beginning seemed to be a pretty good idea. As we were firing at them, they actually began to run back to their planning area like a bunch of fools. At first, they seemed quite confused, but they were still tough as shit. They had knocked Ms. down to the ground, and Haggis would have to come to her rescue as Ripley was firing at them with her blunderbuss. Eventually, Haggis too would hit the ground, and Ripley was the only one left standing. But thankfully, that also meant that the Neanderthals were crawling away for their lives. Most of them were burning alive as well, except for one who we began tending to his wounds, and we would actually take him back to attempt to recruit him. Thankfully, we had no issue recovering from our wounds because the majority of the Neanderthals were using things like clubs that only really bruised us and cracked a few bones, nothing too big. And in the end, we ended up getting some nice yard decor as well, so definitely worth it. A little bit bit of time later, and we finally finished our extensive research into latine cells. I may have called it latent cells earlier, whatever, we ended up finishing it. And now with that research completed, we could begin making the specific types of sails, our sailing instruments, and everything else that we needed to make our very first caravel. As you can see, this particular caravel not only has our standard issued flag that we've been hauling around with us, but it also has a few cannons on the side, which will come into play later. For the name of this ship, I would end up giving it the name of the Gothic Oyster because, well, again, I just kind of liked it. With some time, we would also end up recruiting the one known as Wrath, the Neanderthal that we had recently taken prisoner and began our recruitment attempts. He is now part of our jolly little pirate band. What he lacks in common sense he makes up for with his thick-plated head. And though he was lacking a good bit of clothing, minus his cloak around his neck, we ended up dyeing it, and of course we're all looking very gothic ourselves now. We look like we're attending a funeral, because we are, and it's yours. Now with our crew locked and loaded though, we were going to go out and pillage and loot a little bit more. After loading up our ship with plenty of food, it was time to set sail. This time around, we're going to be sailing west towards the main continent, and as we got close to the shores, we could spot yet another camp in the distance. This appears to be a fair-sized impede hunting camp with quite a few hunters living there. In terms of numbers, we were once again evenly matched with the hunters, but we had something that they definitely did not: cannons aboard our ship. We would immediately open fire. The cannons weren't exactly completely accurate, so we would have to bombard the town for several hours that night, and I do mean several hours. Occasionally, we were getting quite lucky with our shots though, managing to cripple up a few of their members. With the heavy lifting out of the way, it was time for us to get off of our ship and begin attacking them on foot. Luckily for us, they were a bit of a cakewalk at this point, and only one of them managed to get away from us. For those who did end up surviving though, they were crawling around trying to survive, of course, and not be killed, the poor little souls. Anyhow though, we ended up stripping them of their clothing, that way Rat could wear it, and what he didn't wear we could sell. Once we had stripped them of their clothing and other belongings that we could take for ourselves, we would go around and execute them. All except for one who seemed to have a fairly good skill set, and thus we began tending to her wounds, and we would take her prisoner, you know the drill. But we weren't quite done with this place just yet. They had plenty of dead wargs that they had yet to skin, and thus we could make a pretty penny off those leathers, so the captain himself went through and started butchering them. And with that and our new items in tow, we were off, setting sail just south and then a little bit to the west around the continent to try and make it to a nearby friendly village. At which point we began trading off many of the items that we had taken. Notably though, I did end up keeping some recurve bows, as many of our pirates don't currently have ranged weapons, and I thought that would be useful. We would eventually return home with what little bit of weapons that we had collected, as well as our silver that we made from selling the leathers. And now that we are finally home, we would actually end up working on a proper home for Rat, who we had recruited right before leaving, and thus he was basically homeless. But we would also go about collecting plenty of resources such as steel and components from some nearby veins in the mountains, and the reason that we needed these particular resources is because we were going to begin making some more sailing equipment, as well as some masts and ropes and things like that we would actually use to go about building more caravels. In particular, only a couple new ones added on to our fleet. With how well we did with our first on its maiden voyage, imagine if we had an entire fleet of these ships. We could probably rival the power of even the royal forces, assuming they don't bring their navy as well. As for our red caravel, which I do plan on being the flagship of the entire fleet and also the home ship of the Captain Haggis himself, it is actually going to be renamed to the Red Maiden, given its particular color. And as for our other new caravel, we're going to be naming it the Cryptic Creeper, as it has a color that is in between a ghostly white and a darker looking gray, meaning that especially in the dark, but through the fog, it is going to be extremely undetectable. Ripley also renamed a beer bottle that she's been using as a weapon for quite some time to Terrorism. There's no significance behind this, but I thought I should tell you. Now, with all the important things out of the way, we began working out back of the base once more. We started putting in a few smaller fields of crops such as potatoes, cabbage, and some heel root as well. And then after that, I thought, why don't we just go ahead and fortify the whole damn place? So we actually started building a lot of wooden barricades around this same area, and we actually outlined those wooden barricades with stone chunks, giving us further cover from any gunfire or arrow fire and protecting us further, of course, and we also built some proper pathing between it all. Now, most of our members still only have their axes, knives, and bow and arrows as well, but that won't stop us from building some swivel cannons around these defenses to help us protect our perimeter. Now, the front of our little hideout here is pretty well protected by these caravels that we've been building with their cannons, but I also wanted to build a few swivel cannons out here on the beach just for good measure. And by the end of it, we were looking like a true pirate hideout, a true pirate outpost, even very well protected. I think we'll be able to handle ourselves quite well here if and when we get attacked once more. With priority 1, i.e. our defenses around the hideout, finally completed, we could begin focusing on some other things, such as building ourselves a very large dock. This should make it quite easier for us to store our ships here, as well as any items that we get from looting or raiding, pillaging, and taking those back into the base itself. Took us a while to finish up the docks, but as fall is nearing an end and winter is just around the corner, it would seem that we are finally getting our first hard snow. This seems like just as good a time as any for us to go out and start pillaging and raiding once more. We should do it before the snow really gets stacking up. It might be a bit harder for us to jump off onto the beaches if they're frozen. But I'm afraid that the beaches aren't the only things going to be frozen, as it would appear that Ms. has a frozen heart after rejecting Haggis's proposal once again, this time for the final time, as they have broke up. This is going to make sailing quite awkward. It's a good thing that we have multiple ships now, as Ms. can command her own and they won't have to be in the same cabin together. Ms. had also kicked his ass out of the bedroom, forcing him to sleep on our dining room floor. The poor captain is going through it at the moment, it would seem. But regardless of their relationship quarrels and drama, they would still set sail and start heading a little bit to the northwest, where we had received information about an item stash. As we were sailing here, we were hoping that this was some type of buried treasure or something, and we wouldn't have to fight for it. But it would appear that is not going to be the case, as the place is absolutely crawling with Prussian soldiers. But that's alright, we do enjoy a good fight from time to time. Prepare yourselves, Prussians, for you're about to be bombarded. Well, I think that did the trick, although we did end up completely destroying the item stash, I notice, as they're all fleeing. Oh well, you do have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, as they say. Besides, it looks like the rifles, grenades, and every other weapon that was in there is intact still, for the most part at least. I don't really know how many we lost, but we still have quite a few left. As you may have noticed, we had also stripped the few remaining living Prussian soldiers that were here of their gear, that way we could take it and sell it or use it ourselves, and we plan on leaving them here to freeze to death while naked. We began making our way south towards the village that we've been trading with thus far. It is a village, but also something of an outpost. But if you think we're here to sell them goods, you are sadly mistaken. I'm afraid that we are here to pillage and loot. The reason I bring up that this village is more of an outpost is because it is heavily guarded. As we've seen with recent events like at the item stash, that's not really an issue for us with our cannons on our caravels. But as you can see, that won't be a possibility here, as their village is much farther away from the ocean than any other place that we've visited thus far, so we're going to have to try to think outside the box on this one. So we began to think, if the defense force of this little trading outpost village won't come to the ocean for us to blow them up, we'll have to bring the ocean to them. And thanks to our newly acquired rifles, this shouldn't be all that difficult. We would approach their village in something of a line formation, standing behind each other, shooting over each other's shoulders with these newly acquired rifles, doing quite a bit of damage, attempting to lead the villagers back towards our ships. But it was during this strategic retreat that Miz was downed. As the battle raged on, bullets whizzing overhead, she was attempting to crawl for her life. We had absolutely no way of rescuing her at the moment, as we had our backs against the walls, or in this case, the ocean, which eventually we would end up reaching the shoreline, jumping aboard our ships. The villagers didn't know it yet, but they had made a grave error. After blasting the absolute shit out of them, the only thing that they could do, the smartest choice available to them, was for them to flee their little home here, leaving it to us. We had rushed to Miz to begin tending to her wounds. By this point, close calls with death is becoming quite commonplace for her, it would seem, but luckily she wouldn't die this time either. With that taken care of, the only thing left for us to do now would be to go building to building, looking for any more villagers that we might be able to capture and sell, or also take all their goodies. Most notably, we would end up finding an exquisite plasteel axe that is sure to be worth a pretty penny, as well as 622 pieces of silver. Once we had finally loaded everyone and everything back up into the ships, it was time for us to make the very long journey all the way back home. This journey, sailing these 7 seas to the item stash, to the village, and then all the way back home, would carry us from late fall into about late winter, as sailing can take a very long time. Nevertheless, after arriving, it was time for us to finally get comfortable in some warm bedrolls instead of the shitty ones that are aboard the cabins of the ships, as well as taking our prisoners into their little makeshift cell. We would also begin focusing on hauling in all of the weapons, the silver, the food, everything that we managed to loot. This was our biggest score yet. And with that, my friends, it is once again Christmas time. Not to worry, even pirates celebrate for the holidays. We went out, got some pine trees, and decorated them as best we could. Though our celebrations are fairly modest, they are still quite enjoyable, as we would sit around the table, smoke some cigarettes together, enjoy some beers, and plot out our next big score. And even if the two of us aren't exactly together anymore, we can still enjoy each other's companies and stay friends, you know, maybe. But as we celebrate Christmas, we also can't help but ponder that just a year ago, young Miz was lying out in the snow, about to bleed to death, missing both of her legs. And with this new year, things have really changed. And I guess what I'm really getting at is, if this is what we've experienced and how we've grown in 1 year, who knows what next year will be like. I hope you all had and also have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. See you later.